for. And guess who was one of the very first world leaders to send congratulations? None other than Chinese President Xi Jinping himself. Now, you might be thinking, so what? Leaders congratulate other leaders all the time. Is diplomatic protocol. But when you look closer at what Xi actually said, a much bigger picture starts to emerge. According to the official statement from China's Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Xi stressed that he attaches great importance to the development of China-Portugal relations. He expressed his readiness to work with Seguro to enhance strategic communication, consolidate high-level mutual trust, promote high-quality cooperation, and continuously enrich the connotation of the China-Portugal Comprehensive Strategic Partnership. Did you catch all of that? Strategic communication, high-level mutual trust, comprehensive strategic partnership. This is not the language of casual diplomacy. This is the language of courtship. And China has been courting Portugal for a very long time. To understand why Beijing is so eager to lock arms with Lisbon, we need to go back almost 50 years to 1979. That was the year Portugal and China formally established diplomatic relations. And the reason they could do that? A little place called Macau. For over 400 years, Macau was administered by Portugal, making it one of the longest colonial relationships in modern history. The Portuguese first arrived in 1553, and by 1557, they had established a permanent settlement. For centuries, Macau served as a crucial trading post linking Asia to Europe. But unlike the often contentious negotiations between Britain and China over Hong Kong, Portugal and China managed to resolve the Macau question with what both sides call political wisdom. The handover happened on December 20th, 1999, and it was remarkably smooth. No protests, no crackdowns, just a peaceful transfer that Beijing has held up ever since as a model for what they call national reunification. Xi specifically mentioned in his message that the two countries have adequately resolved the issue of Macau and have maintained close coordination on international affairs. Translation: Portugal played ball with us on a sensitive issue, and we have been rewarding them ever since. And boy, have they been rewarded. Let me take you back to 2011. Portugal was on its knees. The global financial crisis had hit southern Europe like a wrecking ball, and Portugal was forced to accept a €78 billion bailout from the European Union and the International Monetary Fund. The price? They had to sell off national assets. Fast. China saw its opportunity and pounced. First came China Three Gorges, the state-owned company that operates the world's largest dam. They paid €2.7 billion for a 21.35% stake in EDP, Portugal's biggest energy company and one of the largest renewable energy producers in the world. That made China Three Gorges the single largest shareholder of a company that supplies power to millions of Europeans. But the investment was not just about money. Under the deal, China Three Gorges committed to invest an additional €2 billion in EDP's renewable energy projects. They bought minority stakes in wind farms across Europe, Brazil, and the United States. They gained access to cutting-edge clean energy technology. One expert told reporters that Chinese companies are saving 20 to 25 years on the learning curve by partnering with European companies like EDP. Then came State Grid Corporation of China, the world's largest utility company. They bought 25% of REN, Portugal's national grid operator, for €387 million. That means Chinese state-owned companies now have significant stakes in both the generation and transmission of electricity in a European Union member state. And in 2018, China Three Gorges tried to buy the entire EDP company for €9.1 billion. The bid ultimately failed because shareholders refused to change the company's statutes that prevented any single investor from owning more than 25%. But the intent was crystal clear. Consider what this means. Chinese state-owned companies, ultimately controlled by the Chinese Communist Party, own significant pieces of European critical infrastructure. Some security analysts have raised concerns about what might happen in a crisis. Others point out that Chinese management has actually been quite good for these companies. And then there is the port of Sines. If you have never heard of Sines, you are not alone. It is a small town on Portugal's southwestern coast, about 100 kilometers south of Lisbon. But strategically, is pure gold. The port of Sines is the largest deepwater port in Portugal and one of the deepest in Europe. It handles over 42 million tons of cargo every year. It is the primary entry point for liquefied natural gas coming into Portugal. And with the right infrastructure, it could become the gateway for energy exports to all of Europe. But here is the thing. China wants it too. Beijing sees Sines as the perfect Atlantic endpoint for the Belt and Road Initiative, their trillion-dollar plan to build infrastructure across Asia, Africa, and Europe. Chinese state media has literally described Sines as a European axis for the Belt and Road that could help jumpstart further infrastructure plans. In 2018, when Xi Jinping visited Portugal, the two countries signed 17 memorandums of understanding, including one formally linking Portugal to the Belt and Road. President Marcelo Rebelo de Sousa, Seguro's predecessor, said at the time that Portugal is the important junction that links the Silk Road and the Maritime Silk Road. The Americans noticed. In early 2020, Dan Brulette, then the U.S. Secretary of Energy, made a special trip to Sines. His message was clear. There's a very strong American interest in this port. The U.S. wanted Sines for LNG exports. China wanted it for Belt and Road. And Portugal? Portugal was happy to play both sides. Which brings us to António José Seguro. So, who is this man that Xi Jinping is so eager to build a relationship with? Seguro is 63 years old, born on March 11, 1962, in the small town of Penamaker, in central Portugal. His father ran a newsstand. His family were rural workers. He entered politics young, rising through the ranks of the Socialist Party to become Secretary General from 2011 to 2014. But then something happened. A young, ambitious politician named António Costa challenged him for the leadership. They held Portugal's first-ever open primary, and Costa crushed him. Seguro resigned on the spot and essentially vanished from public life for a decade. He went back to teaching at university, stayed out of the spotlight, and watched as Costa went on to become Prime Minister and then President of the European Council. Most people thought Seguro's political career was finished. But politics has a funny way of giving people second chances. In October 2024, Pedro Nuno Santos suggested Seguro as a potential presidential candidate. At first, polls showed him at barely 10%. Nobody thought he had a chance. The country was polarized. A far-right party called Chega, meaning enough in Portuguese, had surged to become the second-largest force in parliament. Founded by André Ventura, a former sports commentator, Chega had tapped into frustrations about immigration and the political establishment. Seguro positioned himself as the antidote, a moderate, a consensus builder, someone who could work with Portugal's center-right minority government rather than against it. He promised to be a demanding and vigilant president, but never a counterpower. In the first round of voting on January 18th, Seguro came first with 31%, but that was not enough to avoid a runoff. His opponent, André Ventura himself. It was only the second time in Portuguese democratic history that a presidential election went to a second round. Ventura ran on an anti-immigration platform. He put up billboards saying this is not Bangladesh and immigrants should not be allowed to live on welfare. He was testing just how far the populist tide could carry him. It did not carry him far enough. On February 8th, despite devastating storms that killed 7 people and caused €4 billion in damage, Portuguese voters turn out in force. Seguro won with 66.7% of the vote. It was the highest vote total in Portuguese democratic history. European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen congratulated Seguro and said Portugal's voice for our shared European values remains strong. And that is where things get truly interesting. Because Seguro now has to navigate one of the most treacherous geopolitical landscapes in decades. On one side, you have the United States under President Trump, which has imposed massive tariffs on goods from around the world. The average effective tariff rate in 2025 was the highest since 1947. A trade deal was struck with the EU last summer, but European goods still face 15% tariffs, and steel and aluminum tariffs remain at 50%. The transatlantic relationship is strained like never before. On the other side, you have China, which is offering investment, infrastructure, and a strategic partnership. Beijing talks about win-win cooperation, about respecting sovereignty, about not interfering in internal affairs. It sounds appealing compared to Washington's demands for defense, spending increases, and market access. The European Union is trying to thread the needle. They call it de-risking, not decoupling. The idea is to reduce dependence on Chinese supply chains for critical materials while maintaining trade relationships. But in practice, it is incredibly messy. Take electric vehicles. China now produces about 20% of electric vehicles sold in Europe. Brussels has imposed tariffs to protect European manufacturers, and China has retaliated with tariffs on European dairy. Meanwhile, Chinese companies like BYD are building factories in Hungary, which has positioned itself as Beijing's closest ally in the EU. Or take rare earths. China controls about 70% of global rare earth mining and nearly 90% of processing. In 2025, Beijing tightened export controls, threatening European auto, tech, and defense industries. The restrictions were only eased after Trump met Xi in South Korea, and the EU was essentially sidelined. The EU's trade deficit with China has ballooned to over €400 billion. Chinese manufacturing overcapacity is flooding European markets with cheap goods. Analysts warn that Europe is being squeezed between the American hammer and the Chinese anvil. Portugal sits right in the middle of this chaos. It has deep economic ties with China, but it is also a NATO member and a founding member of the European Union. It has a strategic port that both superpowers want. And it has a new president who has built his reputation on being a moderate consensus builder. Xi Jinping knows exactly what he is doing. By reaching out to Seguro immediately, before the dust has even settled on the inauguration, he is sending a signal. We value this relationship. We want to build on it. We are ready to deal. The message stressed 47 years of diplomatic relations, mutual respect, beneficial cooperation, and close coordination on international affairs. The language was warm, collegial, almost friendly. Compare that to the transatlantic relationship right now. The Trump administration has demanded that Europe buy $750 billion worth of American energy. It has pushed for European tariffs on American goods to be eliminated while American tariffs remain. Defense officials have questioned whether the United States would honor its NATO commitments. The tone is transactional at best, hostile at worst. So what is Seguro going to do? The smart money says he will try to balance. Keep the Chinese investment flowing. Keep the American alliance intact. Keep the EU happy. It is what Portugal has always done, and it has served them well. But the world is changing. The space for neutrality is shrinking. At some point, Portugal may have to choose. And that choice will have consequences far beyond its borders. Because Portugal is not just Portugal. It is a gateway, a model, a test case for how smaller European countries can navigate a world where the old rules no longer apply. Xi Jinping understands this. That is why he sent that message. That is why he stressed mutual trust and strategic partnership. That is why he is already looking ahead to the next 5 years, the next 10 years, the next generation of leaders. China plays the long game, and they are very, very patient. The question is whether Europe is paying attention, whether Brussels can offer something more than lectures and regulations, whether the transatlantic alliance can survive another term of America first, whether the Belt and Road will finally reach the Atlantic shores. We are watching history unfold in real time. And it all started with a congratulatory message from Beijing to Lisbon. What do you think? Is China outmaneuvering the West in Europe? Is Portugal making a smart play or a dangerous gamble? Let me know in the comments below. And if you learned something from this video, if it made you think about the world a little differently, then do me a favor. Share it with someone who needs to hear this. Subscribe if you have not already. Hit that notification bell so you never miss an analysis. Remember, in the game of great power competition, the smallest moves can have the biggest consequences. Until next time.